Once upon a time, the Buick Skylark wasn't just a car, it was a songbird that could soar, and man, could this car sing. Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution. Here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, a great collection of more than 170 cars in a wonderful setting, and each one tells a different story of the automotive evolution. Some pretty simple and plain, like some of the cars that you or I might have been driving back in the day, or maybe our parents. But other cars here at the museum, well, they're pretty special. And this car right here, this 1954 Buick Skylark, is one of them. Now, I don't know about you, but for the most part, when I grew up, Buick Skylarks, to be honest with you, weren't that special. I mean, yeah, there were some special ones during that time. There was the Grand Sports, for example, that evolved out of the Buick Skylark. But for most of the time, if somebody told you they were driving a Buick Skylark, it was kind of like, it was okay, it wasn't exciting. I mean, it got you there, it got you back. It was a Buick, so it was slightly upscale. But it really wasn't the kind of thing that an automotive love affair was generally built around. But this 1954 Buick Skylark, this is very different. But before I tell the story of the 1954, I have to go back 1 year earlier to 1953. 1953 was the 50th anniversary of Buick. It was also the year that GM decided to have something called the Motorama. It was a show that was going to travel around the country, both to highlight their vehicles, as well as to highlight technology in the future, and of course, make people more interested in their cars. GM decided to build three very special cars to be associated with that Motorama that year. There was going to be the Oldsmobile Fiesta, the Cadillac Eldorado, and the Buick Skylark. Now, these were cars that in some ways, they were production cars. You could buy them, but they were very limited number, and each one was very special. And the 1953 Buick Skylark, while it was built on the Roadmaster chassis and used a lot of Roadmaster parts, it was also essentially a custom car. I mean, the things they were doing, they actually had to cut the door and put a special line in it. A lot of the parts were very unique to that 1953 Buick Skylark. It was, in essence, a show car that people could buy. It was not cheap, came close to $5,000. They did not build an awful lot of them that year. They only built 1,690 of these. They were only available in a convertible. And initially, the goal was to make them, well, really kind of a European-style sports car. But because they built it on the Roadmaster chassis and because of everything they were doing with it, ultimately became a little bit heavier. They were able to use a new engine that I'll talk about in a moment, but it wasn't really the sports car that they were hoping to create. Still, it captivated a lot of people's attention. And once again, they were only planning to sell a small number, so 1,690, that wasn't too bad. Well, I'll tell you what, the guy who was in charge of styling at General Motors, Harley Earl, he loved this car. And as a result, he said, well, wait a minute, let's don't make it just a one-year car, let's make it 2 years. So they decided to bring the Skylark back for a second year, and that's exactly what we have here, this 1954 Buick Skylark. But they also had to make some significant changes. Because that first year Skylark was essentially a custom-built car, they knew they couldn't do that the second year. So as a result, they, well, I won't say cut some corners, but they did some things so that it was less expensive to build. It used a few more parts, and then this time not off the Roadmaster, it was off the Century Special chassis, and as a result, it was a little less expensive to build, although to be honest with you, it was still close to $5,000. And you understand, that was, I think, 50% more than you were going to spend for a Buick Roadmaster. So this was a very, very expensive car in its day. When it was all said and done, they only built about 836 of these, making it even more rare than that 1953. But they did some things that are styling touches we'll talk about in a moment that made this car special, made it stand out. In some ways, made it more drivable, more fun. It's actually a little bit lighter than that 1953 car. And this, well, unfortunately, they only made them for 2 years, that 53 and 54. Then the Skylark name went away for a while and eventually came back. But this car, boy, for something you could buy and drive on the road, it was very special. So let's take a walk around this 1954 Buick Skylark, and we'll start up front with this thing right here, the hood ornament. This was not on the 1953 car, only on the 1954, and Buick liked it so much they decided to continue it the next year on all of their Buicks that you'd see during the 1950s. As I mentioned, this car is slightly different than the 1953 version. The 1953 version had a lot more custom touches. The fenders were actually a little bit lower. These fenders were a little bit higher and a little bit smoother side going down the line. One significant change between 1954 and 1953 was the door. In 1953, this was essentially a custom door that they had to cut apart to put back together. They didn't do that for 1954, so it actually is just a standard stamp piece. But one thing they did add was this little swoosh right here. Kind of reminds me of a backwards Nike swoosh. But it's a nice styling touch that they made for the 1954 to make up for the fact that they weren't making the custom doors. Of course, it has that big chrome spear sweep going down the side, and of course that Skylark logo right there. It also had Kelsey Hayes wire wheels that they started using in 1953 and they continued using. But one thing that was significant about this year was the way they had the colors inside the wheel wells. Notice how the wheel well actually extends back even further than the wheel. It wasn't just around the wheel, it extended back, and you were allowed to get contrasting colors. Seen them in a variety of colors. The most common I've seen is red, but this has sort of a teal or aqua color inside, so it actually looked great. One significant change that they made for 1954 over 1953 was the way they restyled the back completely. Well, we'll start by taking a look at these amazing, and I mean amazing, tail fins, chrome lights that are built in. Look how it goes all the way from there, stretches back. Look at these things, these kind of fingers that come up. It's one massive unit. Now, there's a big difference between the 1953 version and this, and of course, it's a huge difference between the 1954 regular cars that you were going to be able to buy from Buick. Another significant thing they did was they changed the, well, let's call it the angle of the trunk. Instead of coming up and going down, notice it has kind of a barrel shape, and I like these ribs that come down and the way they form across it. So they made some pretty significant changes to the back of this car. In fact, it was probably more significantly different from the back of the car than it was from the front. Opening the hood on this 1954 Buick Skylark is a little tricky, and it's actually different than the 1953. The 1953 had a hood release inside. This actually has two latches outside, which is unusual for the 1950s, but it's safer. It's got one down here, you reach right into the grill, and then there's a second one in here. You reach in, you pull, and when you do this, you have to be careful because you have to pull it carefully from both sides, and notice how it both opens and comes out at the same time. But once you're there, you get that beautiful engine. So why did I call this engine beautiful? That's because it was a massive change for Buick in 1953. Up until that point, they'd really been using for an 8-cylinder engine, a straight 8. Think about how long that thing was. In 1953, they came out with the engine that we these days call the Nailhead engine, 322 cubic inches. It delivered 188 horsepower in 1953. And it was just a better running, more serviceable, smoother engine, and significantly had better horsepower for its weight and for its displacement in its time. Now, in 1954, they made some changes for this car. They redesigned the domed piston area, and as a result, they were able to get another 12 horsepower out of this overhead valve engine, so that's pretty significant. This particular engine is also significant for Buick because this is the engine that pretty much was their mainstay of their line from 1953 all the way through 1967. So this engine that went into the 1953 and that we see here in this 1954 model, where it had 200 horsepower, was a significant step forward for Buick. Now, ultimately, before it was done, I think they were up in the 250, 260 horsepower range with this engine. But considering it came out in 1953, that wasn't too bad. Although, when you look at what was going on over in the Chevrolet world with that small block, ultimately that was going to be more impressive. But still, for Buick, in its day, in its time, this was a very important engine. And in 1953, when this first came out, you could only get this engine in the Skylark, the Roadmaster, and the Series 50 Super. But for 1954, in addition to having this engine in the Skylark, they could also get this engine across the range for Buick, which is probably another reason why the Buick Skylark in 1954 didn't sell quite as many as they did in 1953, because some of the things that made that 53 car special were now being made available across the line for Buick. Having said that, this is still a pretty darn cool car. Another significant change for 1954 was the windshield. In 1953, they essentially used a custom cut-down windshield from the Buick Roadmaster. They didn't want to do that in 1954, but they had an advantage because in 1954, Buick was moving to this really nice wraparound windshield, and it was much better for visibility. I mean, you didn't have that pillar coming down right here. And you have to remember, it was really just a few years earlier that cars were using two-piece windshields with a bar that would go down the center. So not just to have a huge opening, but to have that big, beautiful wraparound, very complex piece of glass. Well, this made visibility out the front of this car even better than 1953. This Skylark wasn't just a beautiful car, it was also beautifully comfortable. You have to remember now, Buick was just a notch below Cadillac, right? The goal was to make this a luxury car. And because it was a car being built in a low production level, they wanted it to be as nice as possible. They weren't going to sell a lot of these cars. We've talked about the concept of a halo car, something that the car company wants the public to look at and think that all their cars are spectacular, and that's exactly what the goal of this Buick Skylark was back in 1954. Now, from a driving perspective, the 1954 car is probably better to drive than the 1953 for a couple of reasons. Now, I mentioned that wraparound windshield on the outside. In 1953, they actually lowered the seats just a little bit because that windshield was so low, because they'd cut it down. To get a good view out, they actually lowered the seat and they had the steering wheel at a different angle. Well, with this wraparound windshield that they were using in 1954, they were able to raise things up just a little bit, both the front seat and the back seat as well, so that it was actually a better view. From a driving perspective, you could actually look out and look at see all four corners a lot easier than you could if you were driving a 1953 model. Inside, boy, it was luxurious. Leather, notice the two-tone seats. You also had a two-tone dashboard, which is important to point out. They also had this Selectronic, it's a Delco radio right there at AM, and down on the floor there was a button that you could use to seek different channels. Think about that. This is 1954. Think how high-tech that was. Now, styles were changing in 1954. We were getting away from some of the Art Deco styling from the generations before, but still, when you look at this, I love the knobs. And once again, let's go back to the 1950s, how everybody wanted to be, aircraft styling. That's exactly what you had with these controls that were just off to the side. And it's important to point out that the door, when you got into this car, is actually wider, which meant if you were going to get either into the front seat or even into the back seat, it was 4 inches wider, and as a result, it was more comfortable to get in or out of this car. So inside, this Buick Skylark pretty much delivers on all the promises that they were making back in those Motorama show days when they had this Buick Skylark as something special for people to buy. The 1954 Buick Skylark is actually a better driving car than the 1953 for a number of reasons. To start with, they actually added tubular front shocks. They also stiffened some of the crossframe members. And they cut the curb weight by 70 pounds and added more horsepower. As a result, this car had more performance. It actually drove better. One of the odd things about the 1953 car was that the rear track was actually 2 inches wider than the front. As a result, in 1954, they made it the same front and rear, and this car handles much better than the 1953 version. This 1954 Skylark has a much different line down the side than the 1953 version. The 1953 has a sort of a step-down fender. This has a much taller fender on the side. It's really beginning to look forward to what the GM products were going to look like throughout the mid-50s with those taller slab-sided look. But the taller fenders here and in the back, the rear fenders have a much more defined look. Once again, taller, straighter, better looking than the 1953. I think from a styling perspective, this 1954 version really does a much better job than the 1953 version. Well, the Skylark definitely achieved the goals that they had for it back in the 1950s. It was a Motorama show car. They took it around the country and people thought, boy, what a great looking car. Maybe I'll buy myself a Buick, and Buick sales did pretty well. The Skylark name, however, was only in 53 and 54 for the 1950s, and then it went away. We didn't actually see another Skylark until the 1960s, and when it did reemerge, it was a very different creature than what we see here. As I mentioned, a lot of the Skylarks moving forward became entry-level cars. And yeah, they were amazing. mainstay. A lot of people drove those Buick Skylarks over the years. But if you want to go back to the beginning of the name for Buick, this car right here, this Skylark, this 1954 version, that combination of the 53 and the 54 together. And remember, this car was successful enough in 1953 that they actually brought it back for a second year in 1954. And once again, it didn't sell a huge number, but as a result of it coming back, well, it established the fact that Buick had something special out there. And today, if you find a 1953 or a 1954 Buick Skylark, they're pretty special cars to drive, special cars to own, special cars just to see. My favorite thing of all, though, has to be those taillights at the back. I just love the styling, that Harley Earl fin that's coming up. It's going to be even bigger in just a few years, and the way they did that. And trying to find those taillights right now in good condition, that's a pretty tricky thing to do if you were to have to replace that. But this one here at the museum, at the Martin Auto Museum, is a great example of this 1954 Buick Skylark and the fact that they made this car something special, a songbird that could really sing back in the mid-50s.